The Saint-Michel Café, a quiet establishment nestled in the heart of a sleepy French town, had never been the site of anything more dramatic than a dispute over an unpaid bill. Its patrons, mostly locals, preferred routine over surprises. But on a chilly autumn morning, the café's stillness was shattered by a crime so confounding that even the most seasoned officers of the Sûreté found themselves at a loss. It began when Henri Lemoine, the café's owner, arrived early to prepare for the morning rush. The scent of coffee beans and fresh bread should have greeted him, but instead a strange metallic odour hung in the air. At first he thought little of it, perhaps something from the kitchen, but as he stepped further inside, the sight before him sent a jolt of horror through his chest. At a corner table, near the window that overlooked the square, sat a man slumped forward, his arms folded as if he had dozed off over his coffee. The problem was that the man was dead. Lemoine, trembling, edged closer. The man was well dressed, his suit immaculate except for the dark stains spreading across his crisp white shirt. A single bullet hole in the center of his chest was the only visible wound. The cup of coffee before him remained untouched, still warm. What made the scene more unsettling was the fact that there was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned chairs. It was as if the victim had simply sat down and died. The police arrived swiftly, led by Inspector Maigret, a sharp-eyed veteran with a reputation for solving cases others found impenetrable. Maigret took one glance at the body, his mind already forming questions. A murder in a café in broad daylight, with no witnesses? The Saint-Michel Café had yet to open, meaning no one should have been inside except the staff. Yet there were no signs of forced entry. No weapon was found. More perplexing still was the small object clutched in the dead man's left hand, a torn playing card, the ace of spades. The edges were frayed, as though it had been handled repeatedly. Was it a clue or merely a coincidence? The victim's identity was soon confirmed as Alain Durand, a lawyer from Paris with no known connection to Saint-Michel. No one in the café recognized him, nor did anyone recall seeing him enter. The café's doors had been locked all night, and there was no sign of forced entry. How had he arrived, and why had no one heard the gunshot? The café's staff was questioned immediately. Lemoine swore he had locked the doors the previous night. The young waitress, Sophie, claimed she had never seen the victim before. The cook, Bernard, had arrived only minutes before Lemoine and found nothing unusual. The patrons who frequented the café had not seen Durand before either. Moreau studied the scene again, looking for anything that didn't belong. The playing card nagged at him. It was an odd thing to find at a crime scene, unless it meant something. And then there was the lack of a bullet casing. If the gun had been fired here, there should have been some trace of it. But the crime scene was impeccably clean. Outside, a cold breeze swept through the square, rattling the sign above the café door. The town remained eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. Moreau knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary murder. Moreau stood in the café's dim light, his sharp gaze scanning the scene again. The crime was too perfect, too neat. A dead man, a locked café, and no weapon. It was the kind of mystery that taunted a detective, demanding to be unraveled. He crouched beside the victim and examined the playing card once more. The ace of spades, a symbol of misfortune, of death in some circles. But why would Durand be holding it? And why only half a card? The forensic team arrived, taking careful photographs and dusting for prints. Moreau watched as they worked, his mind running through possibilities. The lack of a bullet casing suggested either a revolver or that the killer had taken great care to remove any trace of the shot, yet the cafe's walls bore no sign of a bullet's exit. Had Durand been shot elsewhere and placed here? That would explain the silence, but not how he was locked inside. Moreau turned to Lemoine. "Are you certain all the doors were locked when you arrived?" The cafe owner, still pale, nodded fervently. "Yes, Inspector, the front and back doors, the windows too. No one could have come or gone without forcing their way in." The inspector's brow furrowed. If that were true, then there were only two explanations. Either Lemoine was lying, or the killer had a key. Moreau made a mental note to verify every key holder. He moved to Sophie, the waitress, who stood ringing, her hands near the counter. "You said you'd never seen this man before, but think carefully. Maybe not here, maybe elsewhere?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "No, Inspector, never." Moreau narrowed his eyes. He had been a detective long enough to recognize hesitation, the fleeting pause before a denial. But pressing her now would only make her retreat further. He made another note. One of the forensic officers approached, holding a small evidence bag. "Inspector, something strange. No fingerprints on the coffee cup. Not the victim's, not anyone's." Moreau's lips tightened. A cafe was full of fingerprints, cups handled by waitstaff, customers, washed, reused. But this cup had been wiped clean. That meant intent. Whoever had placed it there had wanted to erase their presence. He straightened and turned his attention back to the body. Durand's wallet and identification were intact, nothing stolen. This wasn't a robbery. His pockets contained only the usual, a folded train ticket from Paris to Saint-Michel, a hotel key from the modest Auberge du Marché, and a single receipt from this very cafe, dated the night before. Moreau studied the receipt. So he was here last night. Lemoine hesitated, then nodded. Oui, he was. Came in late, had a coffee, sat in the same spot, left before closing. Alone? A man joined him briefly. I didn't recognize him, but it wasn't unusual. Travelers meet people. Moreau tapped the receipt against his palm. The victim had been here before, and he hadn't come to Saint-Michel on a whim. He had a purpose. He turned back to Sophie. "You served him last night?" Her hands clenched at her apron. "Oui, Inspector. Did he say anything? Was he expecting someone?" She hesitated again, then bit her lip. He asked about a man, a local." The cafe fell silent. Even Lemoine looked startled. Moreau stepped closer. "Who?" Sophie swallowed hard. "Émile Caron." At the name, Lemoine let out a low curse under his breath. Moreau understood why. Émile Caron had once been a respected businessman, but his name was now spoken only in whispers. A year ago he had vanished without a trace. Some said he fled to escape debts. Others believed something darker had happened. His disappearance had remained an open case, unsolved and fading from memory. Until now, Durand had come to Saint-Michel looking for Émile Caron. And now Durand was dead. Moreau could feel the pieces shifting, the edges of a conspiracy forming in the shadows. The question was, who had wanted to keep Karen's name buried, and how far were they willing to go to make sure it stayed that way? Moreau studied Sophie's face, noting the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the fabric of her apron. The name Émile Caron had rattled her. That was clear. He let the silence linger just long enough to see if she would fill it, but she only lowered her gaze, as if hoping to disappear into the background of the cafe. "Did Durand say why he was looking for Karen?" Moreau asked, his voice even. Careful. Sophie shook her head quickly. No, Inspector, just that he needed to find him. And you told him what exactly? I said I hadn't seen Karen in a long time, that no one had. Moreau nodded slowly, his instincts sharpening. Technically, it wasn't a lie. Karen had vanished a year ago and no one had seen him since, but there was something about the way she said it, a forced finality, as if she wanted the subject closed. Before he could press further, Lemoyne cleared his throat. Inspector, with all due respect, everyone knows Karen is gone. There's no point dredging up old ghosts. Moreau turned to him, his expression unreadable. Apparently Alain Durand thought otherwise, and now he's dead. Lemoyne fell silent, his jaw tightening. The café was quiet except for the occasional scratch of a forensic officer's pen, the click of a camera shutter. Moreau straightened. Sophie, Lemoyne, you'll both need to come to the station for formal statements. Bernard, you as well. The cook, who had been standing stiffly by the kitchen door, let out a sharp breath.
Me? I wasn't even here when it happened. You work here. You have a key. That makes you part of the investigation. Bernard scowled but said nothing. Moreau motioned to one of his officers to escort them outside. He stayed behind a
moment longer, letting his gaze drift over the café once more. The crime scene was too perfect, the details too controlled. Whoever had killed Alain Durand wasn't just trying to get away with murder, they wanted to send a message. An hour later, at the police station, Moreau sat across from Lemoyne in a cramped interrogation room. The café owner had his arms folded tightly, a defensive posture. "Tell me about last night," Moreau said. "From the beginning," Lemoyne exhaled through his nose. Durand arrived late, ordered a coffee, sat in the corner. Alone, at first, Moreau tapped his fingers against the desk. Then someone joined him, a man. Describe him. Lemoyne hesitated. 40, maybe.
50. Dark coat, hat low over his face. I didn't get a good look. Moreau tilted his head. You own the café.
You know every regular who walks through your doors, but you didn't get a good look at a stranger having a late-night meeting with a man who turned up dead hours later? Lemoyne's jaw clenched. That's the truth. Moreau let the lie settle between them before shifting tactics. Did you hear what they talked about? They spoke quietly. But you heard something. Lemoyne's eyes flickered. A slight movement, almost imperceptible. Only one thing. Moreau waited. The stranger said, "It's done." That's all I caught. A slow tension crawled up Moreau's spine. It's done. A phrase with too many possible meanings, none of them good. He leaned forward. And Durand? How did he react?
He looked surprised, then nervous. Moreau studied Lemoyne carefully. There was still something he wasn't saying. But before he could press, there was a knock at the door. One of his officers stepped inside. Inspector Bernard's.
Statement is inconsistent. Moreau raised an eyebrow. In what way? The officer checked his notes. At first, he said he arrived this morning with Lemoyne and Sophie, but when pressed, he admitted he got there a few minutes earlier. Moreau turned back to Lemoyne. Did you know that? The cafe owner's expression darkened. No, Moreau stood abruptly. Let's see what Bernard has to say for himself. Minutes later, Bernard sat in the same chair, arms crossed. He was less nervous than Lemoyne. If anything, he seemed irritated. You lied about what time you arrived, Moreau said without preamble. Why? Bernard scowled. It wasn't a lie, I just didn't think it mattered. It matters, Moreau said. Tell me exactly when you got to the cafe and what you saw, Bernard exhaled sharply. I got there maybe 10 minutes before Lemoyne. I saw the front door was locked like always, but when I went around the back, the door was
slightly open.
Moreau stilled. The back door was open? Bernard nodded. Not all the way, just a crack. I figured maybe Lemoyne forgot to close it properly, so I didn't think much of it. I went in, headed straight to the kitchen, and didn't notice anything wrong until Lemoyne found the body. Moreau's mind whirred. If the back door had been open, it meant someone had either entered or exited that way. Lemoyne had sworn everything was locked when he arrived, but Bernard had been there first. That meant one of two things. Either Bernard had killed Durand and was lying, or someone had slipped out just before he arrived. "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" Moreau asked, his voice deceptively calm. Bernard shrugged. "I didn't want to be accused of something I didn't do. You realize how that makes you look. I didn't kill him, Inspector." Moreau held his gaze. "Then who did?" Bernard's mouth twitched like he was holding something back. Moreau leaned forward. "Bernard, if you're hiding something, now is the time to speak." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Bernard exhaled. "There was someone else," he admitted. "When I got there, someone standing in the alley behind the cafe." Moreau felt a sharp pulse of anticipation. "Who?" Bernard shook his head. "I don't know.
Man. He had his back to me, wearing a dark coat. When he saw me coming, he walked away fast. I didn't think much of it at the time." Moreau's fingers tightened against the table. The man in the dark coat.
The same one Lemoyne had described from the night before. Whoever he was, he had been at the cafe both before and after Durand's death, and that meant he wasn't just a witness, he was the key to everything. Moreau sat in his office, a cigarette, burning idly between his fingers as he stared at the evidence spread before him. The dead man, Alain Durand, had come to Saint-Michel for a reason. He had been searching for Émile Caron. That much was clear. And now he was dead, executed in a locked cafe with a missing bullet casing and a wiped-clean coffee cup. Every detail of the crime pointed to premeditation, to a killer who had taken care to leave as little behind as possible. And yet, the torn ace of spades clutched in Durand's hand felt like something deliberate. A message. But from whom? And to whom? The pieces refused to settle neatly. Every suspect had something to hide, but no single story explained it all. Lemoyne was nervous, too quick to insist that Durand's visit had been unremarkable. Sophie, the waitress, had hesitated when mentioning Karen's name, as though afraid to say too much. Bernard had lied about what time he arrived, and then admitted seeing a man in a dark coat lurking near the cafe. And then there was the unknown visitor who had met Durand the night before, the one who had spoken the words, "It's done." Moreau exhaled slowly, the smoke curling through the dim light. It was time to start pulling at the threads. He began with the simplest question. Why had Durand come here in the first place? His belongings had offered one clue, his hotel key from the Auberge du Marché. Moreau sent an officer to retrieve the guest register and any possessions Durand had left behind. When the officer returned, the results were intriguing. Durand had checked in under his real name, which suggested he hadn't been trying to hide his presence in town, but he hadn't come alone. The register showed another entry, just 2 lines.
Above his, Victor Fournier. Moreau ran a hand over his jaw. Fournier. That name was familiar.
He rummaged through the case files stacked in his drawer, pulling out the folder on Émile Caron's disappearance. And there it was. Victor Fournier had once been Caron's business partner. Moreau grabbed his coat, It was time for a conversation. Auberge du Marché was a modest inn, its wooden beams creaking under years of weather. The owner, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, directed Moreau to Fournier's room. Moreau knocked firmly. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. With a nod to his officer, he tried the door. It was unlocked. The room was empty, but not untouched. The wardrobe stood open, half its contents gone. The bed was unmade, and a half-smoked cigarette lay in an ashtray, cold but recent. Fournier had left in a hurry. Moreau scanned the room, his gaze landing on the desk. Papers had been disturbed, a drawer left ajar. He moved closer, flipping through the scattered pages. Most were invoices, old business records, but one sheet stood out. A letter. It was addressed to Alain Durand. Alain, I have something. Proof, but I need time. I think someone's watching me. Meet me tomorrow at the old mill outside town. Midnight. Come alone. Victor Moreau's pulse quickened. Fournier had arranged a secret meeting with Durand, but Durand had never made it. He had been killed before he could go, which meant one of two things. Either someone had intercepted the message, or Fournier had set him up. Moreau pocketed the letter and turned to his officer. Find out if anyone saw Fournier leave. Train station, bus stops, check everything. As his officer hurried off, Moreau lingered a moment longer, scanning the room again. Fournier had run, but from what? Had he been afraid of Durand's murder, or had he played a role in it? Back at the station, Moreau laid out what he knew. Durand had come looking for Caron. Fournier had been here too, and he had claimed to have proof. Proof of what? That Caron was still alive? That his disappearance hadn't been voluntary? And who had been watching Fournier? He called Sophie back. This time, she looked even more reluctant to speak. Tell me about Caron, Moreau said. She swallowed. He was well liked, at least by most. And by those who didn't like him, she hesitated. Some people said he had debts, that he owed the wrong kind of money. Moreau leaned forward. Did he? Sophie lowered her gaze. I don't know, but I remember something from the night he disappeared. He was at the café, late, after closing. He was meeting someone. I saw them talking through the window. Moreau's pulse quickened. Who was he meeting? I don't know. I didn't see their face. Moreau exhaled, frustration prickling at him. Another shadowy figure, another missing piece. He let Sophie go and turned his thoughts over again. Caron had vanished a year ago. Durand had come looking for him. Fournier had claimed to have proof of something, but now he had disappeared.
As well. And a man in a dark coat had been at the café both before and after Durand's murder. Wasn't just about Durand.
It had never been. This was about Émile Caron, and somewhere in the tangled web of debts, disappearances and deception, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. The breakthrough came late that afternoon, and it came fast. An officer burst into Moreau's
office, breathless with urgency. We found him, Inspector. Fournier. Moreau's cigarette paused halfway to his lips. Where? At the train station.
He was trying to board the 1640 to Lyon. Moreau was on his feet before the officer had finished speaking. Within minutes, he was striding into the holding room where Fournier sat, dishevelled and tense, a fresh sheen of sweat on his forehead. Yes, we're leaving in quite a hurry, Moreau said, pulling out a chair opposite him. Fournier's jaw tightened. I had my reasons. I'm sure you did. Moreau leaned forward, placing the letter from the inn on the table between them. You asked Durand to meet you, to tell him you had proof of something, and now he's dead. That's quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say? Fournier's fingers twitched against the edge of the table. I had nothing to do with his murder. Then explain why you ran. Fournier hesitated. Because I'm next. Moreau studied him carefully. The fear in his voice wasn't the panicked desperation of a guilty man. It was something deeper, controlled, earnest. What did you mean when you told Durand you had proof? Fournier swallowed hard. I found something, a record, an old
ledger from Caron's business. It shows payments, large ones, but not to suppliers or partners. These were made to an individual, a single name repeated over and over. Moreau's pulse quickened. Whose name? Fournier hesitated. Alain Durand.
The words settled in the air between them, heavy with implication. Moreau narrowed his eyes. Are you telling me that Durand wasn't just looking for Caron? He was involved in his disappearance? Fournier nodded. I think so. And when I found the ledger, I knew I had to show it to him, to see his reaction. He swallowed. But someone got to him first. Moreau exhaled slowly, turning over the new angle. If Durand had been receiving payments from Caron, what was the money for? Blackmail? Silence? Or had Durand been the one responsible for making Caron disappear? And if someone had killed Durand, to silence him, that meant the real culprit was still out there. Before Moreau could press further, there was a sharp knock at the door. One of his officers entered, holding a sheet of paper. Inspector, the fingerprints on Durand's coffee.
Cup came back.
Moreau glanced up. And, the officer hesitated, they match Bernard. Silence. Fournier's eyes darted between them. Bernard? The cook? Moreau's mind raced. Bernard had claimed he never touched the crime scene. Yet here was proof that he had. Moreau pushed back from the table abruptly. Take Fournier to a holding cell. I'll deal with him later. He strode out of the room, heading straight for the interrogation wing where Bernard sat waiting. The man looked up as Moreau entered, irritation flickering across his face. What now? Bernard muttered. Moreau threw the report onto the table. Your fingerprints were found on Durand's coffee cup. Bernard stiffened. That's not possible. Oh, but it is. Care to explain? The cook hesitated, his lips pressing into
a thin line. I cleaned up last night, before closing. Maybe I touched it then. Not good enough, Moreau said sharply. Because that would mean the cup was left out overnight.
But it wasn't. It was on the table, next to his body. Which means either you poured that coffee, or you were there after the murder. Bernard's gaze darted to the door, as if calculating his chances of escape. Moreau leaned forward. Did you kill him? No, Bernard blurted too quickly. I didn't kill anyone! Moreau held his gaze. Then tell me the truth, all of it. Bernard's shoulders slumped. Fine, I was there, but not when it happened. Then when? A few minutes before. Lemoine arrived. Moreau narrowed his eyes. And what did you see? Bernard hesitated. Nothing, at first. But then I saw the back door. It was just barely open. Moreau's pulse quickened. And you still didn't mention that earlier? I panicked, Bernard admitted. I saw Durand, saw the blood, and I knew how it would look. I wiped the cup. I thought if my fingerprints
were there, people would think I did it. Moreau exhaled, watching him carefully. The story lined up. Bernard was hiding something, but not murder. He was just a fool who tampered with evidence. It was enough for the authorities. With Bernard's confession, the case seemed to be wrapped up neatly.
The chief inspector declared the case closed. The papers ran their headlines: "Cook kills man in cafe dispute." Bernard was charged. Moreau watched as his superiors shook hands and congratulated each other, and yet something didn't sit right. Moreau stood by his office window, staring at the rain-slicked streets. The evidence fit too easily, the story too clean. Bernard had lied, yes, but he had no real motive. And what about the man in the dark coat, the figure seen both before and after the murder? Moreau reached into his pocket, pulling out the torn ace of spades that had been found in Durand's hand. A message, a warning, a symbol. The real killer was still out there, and they were waiting for their next move. Moreau sat at his desk long after the station had emptied for the night, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows over the clutter of papers before him. The scent of cold coffee lingered in the air, and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady, as though the city itself was whispering secrets through the downpour. Bernard had been arrested. The chief inspector had declared the case closed, and yet Moreau couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ace of spades. It was the one detail that refused to settle. A killer who had been careful enough to wipe fingerprints and remove a bullet casing wouldn't leave a card behind unless they wanted it to be found. And why that card, of all things? A gambler's omen? A sign of bad luck? Or was it meant for someone specific? He took another drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly as his mind worked through the tangled web of connections. Durand had come looking for Carol. Fournier had unearthed a ledger linking Durand to secret payments, and Bernard had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see. But what had started all of this? Moreau reached for the case file on Carol's disappearance, flipping through the yellowed pages. A respected businessman, well-liked yet rumoured to have debts. A man who vanished without a trace one evening, leaving behind a failing business and a dozen unanswered questions. The official story suggested he had fled to escape his financial troubles, but Moreau had never quite believed it. He scanned the list of names from Caron's inner circle: associates, employees, creditors. Then his gaze stopped on a name he hadn't paid much attention to before: Jean-Paul Lemoine, the cafe owner. Ripple of unease moved through Moreau. Lemoine had been one of the first on the scene after Durand's murder. He had been eager to help, eager to move past the investigation. But how well had he known Carol? Moreau shuffled through the files, searching for more. And then he found it, a witness statement from a year ago filed the night Caron had disappeared. The bartender at Le Chat Gris had reported seeing Carol that night, drinking heavily, and according to the statement, he hadn't been alone. He had been arguing with another man, Jean-Paul Lemoine. Moreau's pulse quickened. If Lemoine and Caron had fought the night he disappeared, what had they been fighting about?
Money? Betrayal? And why had Lemoine never mentioned it? The rain intensified as Moreau pulled on his coat and left the station. The streets glistened under the glow of street lamps, the scent of wet pavement thick in the air. He made his way through
the winding alleys of Saint-Michel until he reached the café. The lights inside were still on. Lemoine was behind the counter, drying glasses. He looked up as Moreau stepped in, his expression carefully neutral. "Inspector," he said, setting
down the glass.
"I thought this business was finished." Moreau ignored the comment. He took a seat at the counter, studying Lemoine carefully. I have a question for you. Lemoine wiped his hands on a towel. Go on. You knew Karen, didn't you? A flicker of something crossed Lemoine's face, but it was gone in an instant. Everyone knew Karen, but you knew him well. Lemoine hesitated. We were acquaintances. Moreau nodded, tapping his fingers against the counter. And yet, the night he disappeared, you were seen with him. Arguing, Lemoine's hand stilled on the towel. Funny you never mentioned that before, Moreau continued. Lemoine exhaled through his nose. It wasn't relevant. I think it was. Lemoine set the towel aside, his jaw tightening. We argued, yes. Karen owed me money. Not just me, half the town, really. He had a way of borrowing and never paying back. He made promises, always talking about some big deal that was going to change everything. But it never came. And
that night, Moreau pressed. Lemoine's eyes darkened. That night, I told him I was done waiting.
Moreau leaned in slightly. Did you threaten him? A bitter chuckle escaped Lemoine's lips. I didn't need to. He was already afraid. That caught Moreau off guard. Afraid of what? Lemoine hesitated. And then, finally, he said, Not what? Who? The cafe was silent, except for the rain tapping against the window. Karen was in over his head, Lemoine continued. He owed money to the kind of people who don't send polite reminders. He thought he could play both sides, borrow from one man to pay another. But in the end, his luck ran out. Moreau felt the weight of the words settle over him. Who was after him? Lemoine hesitated again, then finally muttered, the kind of men who use an ace of spades to send a message. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The card wasn't just a symbol, it was a calling card, a signature. Moreau's mind reeled, piecing it together. Karen had been a gambler, a man drowning in debts, and the people he owed had finally come to collect. If they had been after him a year ago, then maybe he hadn't disappeared on his own. Maybe he had been taken. And if Durand had come sniffing around, asking questions, then whoever was responsible would have had every reason to silence him too. Moreau met Lemoine's gaze. You know who they are. Lemoine swallowed hard, but said nothing. Moreau stood. If you want to walk away from this, you'll tell me everything. Now! Lemoine exhaled sharply. Then finally, his voice low, he said, There's a man. No! One speaks his name openly, but everyone knows. He ran the debts in this town. If Karen crossed him, then Karen was already dead before he even realized it. Moreau felt the cold certainty settle in his bones. The crime wasn't just about the way present. It had begun a year ago in the debts and desperation of a man who had tried to outrun his fate. And now the past was finally catching up. He turned for the door. He had a name to find, and a killer still in the shadows. Moreau left the cafe with a growing sense of urgency. The rain had slowed to a thin drizzle, the streets slick under the dim glow of street lamps. Lemoine's words echoed in his mind. A man who controlled debts in the city, a man everyone feared but no one dared name. If Karen had crossed him, then it wasn't just a case of unpaid money, it was an execution. And now a second murder had followed. The police had their supposed killer, but Moreau knew better. Bernard had been convenient. The ace of spades, the missing ledger, the uneasy silence around Karen's disappearance. It all pointed to something deeper. And if he was right, then someone was still watching, waiting to see if he got too close. He needed to force a mistake. A few blocks away, he found himself outside Bernard's holding cell at the station. The young man sat on the narrow cot, staring at the floor, his shoulders tense. When he looked up and saw Moreau, his eyes flickered with something between exhaustion and defiance. "You have a visitor," Moreau said dryly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Bernard scoffed. "Here to gloat?" "No, I'm
here to offer you a way out." That got Bernard's attention. He straightened slightly, cautious. "What do you mean?" Moreau sat down opposite him, placing his hat on his knee. "I don't think you killed Durand, but someone does, and unless I find the real killer, you'll take the fall." Bernard's jaw tightened. "Then find him." "I intend to, but I need your help."
Bernard hesitated, skeptical. "Why would I help you?" "Because whoever did this left you to rot in here," Moreau said. "Because the same people who killed Durand, Karen, are still out there deciding what to do next." Bernard's expression flickered at Karen's name. Moreau caught it. "You knew him," the detective pressed. "Didn't you?" Bernard exhaled sharply. "I worked for him, not directly. Odd jobs, errands. He was always up to something, always juggling people, debts, favors. He liked to act like he was in control, but he wasn't." "Then who was?" Bernard hesitated. Moreau leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Tell me his name." "I don't know his name," Bernard muttered. "But I know what people called him." Moreau's pulse quickened. "What?" Bernard swallowed. "The Undertaker." A cold silence filled the room. Moreau sat back. He had heard whispers of the name before, a shadow in the city's underbelly, someone who handled debts that could never be repaid in money. Some said he was just a myth, a cautionary tale. Others said he was real. And those who owed him never lived long enough to tell the truth. Moreau studied Bernard carefully. He had given him a name, but he needed more. And he needed to be sure Bernard was telling the truth. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. A coin. He flipped it between his fingers before setting it on the table. "Heads or tails?" Bernard frowned. "What?" "Call it." Bernard hesitated. "Tails." Moreau flipped the coin, caught it, and slapped it onto his wrist. He didn't look at it. Instead, he watched Bernard's face, reading the tension in his expression, the way his fingers twitched against his knee. "You hesitated," Moreau said. Bernard scowled. "So what?" "You weren't sure what to say. Not because you don't care about the outcome, but because you were trying to guess what I wanted to hear." Bernard's jaw tightened. "You're lying about something," Moreau continued. "Not about the Undertaker. No one makes up a name like that. But about your connection to him." He picked up the coin again, rolling it over his knuckles. "Let's try again. What was Karen really into?" Bernard exhaled. He rubbed a hand over his face, then finally said, "It wasn't just gambling debts, it was money laundering. He moved cash for people who couldn't afford to have their
names attached to it." He thought he was smart, thought he could skim off the top without them noticing. "But they did," Moreau murmured. Bernard nodded. "And when they did, he ran. Or tried to."
Moreau tapped the coin against the table. "And you? How do you fit in?" Bernard hesitated again, but this time he met Moreau's gaze directly. "I was supposed to help him disappear." The confession hung between them. Moreau let the silence stretch. "And did you?" Bernard shook his head. "No, he never showed up. I waited that night, but he was already gone." Moreau studied him, looking for signs of deceit, for the subtle ticks that betrayed a half-truth. But Bernard's exhaustion was
real. He wasn't lying. At least, not about that. Moreau stood. "You're not my killer, Bernard, but you're close to them," Bernard scoffed. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Moreau said.
"But it means you still have a chance." He picked up the coin and pocketed it. Then he turned for the door. He had what he needed. Bernard had cracked, just slightly, but enough. He had confirmed the connection between Karen's disappearance and Durand's murder. And more importantly, he had given Moreau a name, the Undertaker. A myth, a ghost, a man who erased debts in blood. If Moreau was right, then the killer wasn't just covering up a crime. They were cleaning up loose ends, and unless he moved fast, he would be next. Moreau stepped out of the station and into the damp night air. The streets were quieter now, the rain reduced to a mist that clung to the glow of street lamps. He rolled. Bernard's words over in his mind, the Undertaker, a ghost in the city's underbelly, a name spoken only in whispers, and yet he was no phantom. He had left a trail, however faint, and Moreau had just picked up the scent. He turned up the collar of his coat and started walking. He needed to return to Karen's apartment, to search it again with fresh eyes. If Karen had been planning to run, he would have left something behind: money, a passport, a contingency plan. But more importantly, if the Undertaker was tying up loose ends, then someone might have already been there to make sure nothing was found. By the time Moreau reached the dimly lit building, the air was heavy with the scent of wet stone and old smoke. The concierge was absent, likely dozing in the back room. Moreau let himself in, climbing the stairs 2 at a time until he reached Karen's flat. The door was ajar. He stopped, his pulse quickening. The lock was broken, the frame splintered where someone had forced their way in. Moreau drew his revolver from his coat and pressed against the wall beside the doorway, listening. Silence. No movement inside. Whoever had been here was already
gone. He nudged the door open with his foot, gun raised, and stepped inside. The place had been ransacked, drawers yanked open, furniture overturned, papers scattered across the floor. The air still carried the faint scent of sweat and adrenaline. Someone
had worked quickly, desperately. Moreau stepped over the mess, scanning for what had drawn them here. He knelt beside the desk, where the papers were the thickest, and sifted through them. Receipts, old betting slips, nothing substantial. Then he saw it, the empty space in the dust where something had been. Moreau frowned. Whatever had sat there had been taken. A ledger, a notebook, something important enough to warrant a break-in. He stood, eyes sweeping the room, searching for anything overlooked. And then he saw it, the fireplace. The embers had long since died, but a pile of scorched paper still sat in the grate, half burned and curling at the edges. Moreau crouched, carefully lifting the charred remains. He could still make out fragments of handwriting, numbers, names. Someone had tried to destroy the evidence, but in their haste they hadn't finished the job. Moreau pulled out his notepad and began copying the legible parts, piecing together what little remained. The same names repeated: Durand, Caron, and one more that sent a chill through him: Lemoine. Moreau's mind raced. The informant had claimed to know nothing about Karen's debts, beyond rumors. Yet here he was, in Karen's records. Was he just another gambler in over his head? Or was his role something more? A floorboard creaked outside. Moreau froze, his fingers tightening around his revolver. He turned his head slightly, listening. Someone was in the hall just beyond the door. They had been watching. Without hesitation, Moreau lunged forward and yanked the door open, gun raised. The corridor was empty, but the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Moreau sprinted after them, his coat billowing behind
him. He hit the landing, catching a glimpse of a shadow disappearing through the building's entrance. Moreau bolted into the street just in time to see a dark figure slip into an alley.
He pursued, boots pounding against wet cobblestones. The alley twisted and narrowed, leading toward the river. Whoever they were, they knew the city well. A sudden movement, a flicker of motion from the side. Moreau barely had time to react before something slammed into him, hard.
He stumbled, the impact sending him against the rough stone wall. He twisted, trying to raise his gun, but a second blow struck his wrist, knocking the weapon from his grip. It clattered to the ground. Then a voice, low and rough. "You should stop digging." Moreau's vision steadied. The figure was masked, dressed in dark clothing. The outline of a knife glinted in the dim light.
Moreau tensed, readying himself. "Not going to happen," he said. The figure exhaled sharply, as if expecting that answer. Then, without another word, they lunged. Moreau dodged, barely avoiding the blade as it slashed past his ribs. He countered, with a sharp elbow to his attacker's arm, forcing them back. The figure recovered quickly, but not before Moreau delivered a hard jab to their stomach. They staggered, breath hitching before regaining balance. A shout rang out in the distance. Someone
had heard the scuffle. The masked figure hesitated just long enough.
Then, with a swift movement, they turned and sprinted toward the river. Moreau grabbed his revolver and followed, but as he rounded the next corner, he saw only rippling water below. His attacker was gone. Moreau stood there, breathing heavily. His ribs ached from the impact, but his mind was sharper than ever. Someone had burned the evidence. Someone had tried to silence him, and now he knew with certainty. The undertaker wasn't working alone. Trust had just become a dangerous luxury. Moreau stood at the edge of the quay, the water below reflecting the pale glow of the streetlights. His breath was still steadying from the fight, his ribs throbbing where the attacker had landed a hit. He glanced down at his revolver, his fingers tightening around the grip. The undertaker wasn't just a ghost pulling strings from the shadows. He had muscle on the streets, people willing to get their hands dirty to protect him. And now Moreau had made himself a target. He turned on his heel and walked briskly back, toward the main road. Whoever had attacked him had left nothing behind, no calling card, no clue, except the one undeniable fact that Moreau was getting too close. The half-burned ledger, the name Lemoine among Karen's dealings, the masked
figure in the alley.
It was all converging on something, and someone was willing to kill to keep it buried. The moment he stepped back onto the boulevard, the city seemed to shift around him. The usual hum of late-night traffic, the distant murmur of conversations. From the cafes, the occasional burst of laughter. It all felt thinner now, like a veneer stretched over something dark and waiting. Moreau exhaled sharply, shaking off the weight pressing against his shoulders. He needed answers, and fast. He was halfway to his apartment when a sound cut through the night. A single, sharp gunshot. Moreau froze. A second shot followed, echoing through the narrow streets. It had come from just around the corner. He sprinted toward the sound, his revolver ready, his heart pounding. As he rounded the bend, he caught sight of a figure staggering against the lamplight, gripping their side. Blood pooled through their fingers. It was Lemoine. Moreau ran toward him. But before he could reach him, Lemoine collapsed against the wall and slid to the ground. His breath was ragged, his eyes wide with pain and something close to fear. "Who did this?" Moreau demanded, kneeling beside him. He pressed a hand to the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "Lemoine, stay with me." The informant coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He tried to speak, his lips forming words that never fully came. Moreau leaned closer. Then, just as Lemoine parted his lips again, a final breath shuddered out of him. His body went still. Moreau cursed under his breath and scanned the street. The shooter was gone, but not far. They had silenced Lemoine before he could talk, another loose end tied up. Moreau's stomach turned. He had just spoken to the man hours ago, pressing him for information. Had he been marked for death because of it? His gaze flicked downward. Something was clutched in Lemoine's left hand. Moreau pried his fingers open, revealing a torn scrap of paper, damp with blood. He unfolded it carefully. A name was scrawled, in shaky, hurried handwriting. Villard. Moreau's blood ran cold. Villard was the owner of the Saint-Michel Café, the very place where this had all begun. He had played the part of the shaken, concerned proprietor well. Too well, perhaps. The street was too exposed. Moreau knew better than to linger at a crime scene when he might be next. Sirens were already wailing in the distance. He slipped the blood-stained note into his coat pocket and vanished into the night. By the time he reached the cafe, the place was locked up, its shutters drawn. Moreau rapped on the door sharply. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. He stepped back, scanning the windows. The upstairs rooms were dark, no movement. Villard wasn't home, or he was pretending not to be. Moreau checked the alley beside the cafe. A side entrance. He tested the handle, unlocked. A mistake or an invitation? He slipped inside, revolver in hand. The cafe was dark, the air thick with the scent of stale tobacco and spilled wine. He moved cautiously through the space, ears tuned for any sound. The place was empty, but something was off. Papers were strewn across the counter, chairs knocked over.
A struggle? A hurried departure? His eyes landed on the register. The till was open, cash still inside. Not a robbery, then. His gut told him Villard had been taken or had fled. A creak sounded from above.
Moreau's grip tightened on his gun. Someone was still here. Slowly, he climbed the stairs, keeping close to the wall. The upper floor was just as dark, the narrow hallway stretching toward a single door at the end. A faint sliver of light shone beneath it. Moreau took a breath, steadied himself, and pushed the door open. The sight made his pulse jump. Villard sat slumped in a chair, his face pale, his wrists tied behind him. A gag was stuffed in his mouth and a nasty bruise bloomed along.
His temple, his eyes widened when he saw Moreau. "Hold on," Moreau muttered, quickly stepping forward. He yanked the gag free. "Too late," Villard gasped. "They know." Moreau's stomach twisted. "Who?" "They're—" Villard's voice broke off as his head lolled forward, unconscious. Moreau untied his wrists, feeling the tremor of adrenaline still in his hands.
Whoever had done this had left him alive, for now. But they had gotten what they wanted. Then he saw it. The words scrawled across the wall behind Villard in black ink. "Keep out of it. Next time it's you." Moreau exhaled slowly. His pulse steadied, but the fire in his chest burned hotter. The undertaker had just made this personal. Moreau sat in the dimly lit back room of the Saint-Michel Café, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. Villard was breathing steadily now, though he had yet to regain consciousness. The warning scrawled on the wall loomed behind him, a stark reminder that he was running out of time. He had faced threats before, but this was different. This was precise, controlled. The undertaker wasn't just cleaning up loose ends. He was toying with Moreau, always staying a step ahead. His mind replayed the last few days, the tangled mess of victims, informants, and missing pieces. The ledger, Lemoine's
murder, Villard's abduction. Everything seemed to connect, yet the final picture remained elusive.
He pulled the blood-stained scrap of paper from his pocket and stared at Villard's name, scrawled in Lemoine's desperate hand. Why had Lemoine written it? Had he been warning Moreau, or had Villard been part of this from the beginning? A rustling noise broke his thoughts. Villard stirred, groaning as he shifted in the chair. His eyelids fluttered, and then his gaze focused, locking onto Moreau with sudden clarity. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, voice raw. "You're welcome," Moreau said dryly. "Now tell me, who did this to you?" Villard swallowed, his throat working. "Doesn't matter. You need to stop before they kill you." "They—"
"Already tried," Moreau shot back. "And now Lemoine is dead. I found him bleeding out in the street not an hour ago." Villard flinched, his expression tightening. He should have stayed quiet. But he didn't, Moreau pressed. "And—"
"Neither should you," Villard exhaled shakily.
"I came here looking for something. Searched the place, tore it apart. I told them I didn't have it, but they didn't believe me." "What were they looking for?" "I don't know," Villard said, shaking his head. "But they weren't—"
"Just thieves. They knew exactly what they wanted." Moreau's fingers tightened around the paper in his hand. He glanced around the room, taking in the overturned chairs, the scattered papers. If the attackers had been searching for something specific, then there was a reason Villard had been kept alive. They thought he still had it, or they were waiting to see if he'd lead them to it. His eyes swept over the mess, looking for anything out of place. The register had been left untouched. The bottles behind the bar were still neatly lined up. He stepped over to the shelves, running a hand along the edge. A faint layer of dust clung to the surface, except in one spot, a small gap where something had once been. Moreau turned back to Villard. "What was here?" Villard's eyes flicked toward the empty space, then away. "Nothing important." "You're a terrible liar." Moreau crossed the room in 2 strides. "Whatever was here, they wanted it badly enough to beat you unconscious. So tell me, what was it?" Villard hesitated, then sighed. "A box." "What kind of box?" "Small, wooden. Looked like an old cigar case. I found it in the cellar when I bought the place years ago. Never thought much of it." Moreau's mind clicked into motion. An old box, hidden away, forgotten until now. "What was inside?" "I never opened it," Villard admitted. "Didn't seem worth the trouble." Moreau stared at him, disbelief flickering across his face. "You had something people were willing to kill for, and you didn't even look."
"Inside?" Villard shifted uncomfortably. "I figured if it was worth something, someone would come for it eventually. And now they have."
Moreau exhaled sharply. "Where is it now?" Villard hesitated just long enough for Moreau to know the answer before he even spoke. "Gone." Moreau closed his eyes for a moment, forcing down the frustration bubbling inside him. "Who took
"It? I don't know," Villard admitted. "I stashed it in the wine cellar. When I came down one morning, it was gone." A new thread of thought wove itself into Moreau's mind.
The undertaker's men had been looking for something that had already vanished. And if the box had disappeared before they arrived, Then someone else had taken it. Someone who had known it was there. The pieces rearranged themselves in his mind. The missing box, Lemoyne's murder, Villard's cryptic warning. It was all connected. But there was something else. Something he was missing. Until his eyes landed on the counter. A single shot glass sat near the edge, the faintest trace of liquid still clinging to its rim. It hadn't been there before. Moreau's pulse quickened. The cafe was closed. No one else had been inside, except him and Villard had been unconscious. Moreau's revolver was in his hand before he even turned. The moment he spun around, the door to the cafe swung open. A man stood in the entrance, backlit by the glow of the streetlights. His coat was damp from the mist rolling in off the river, his hat pulled low over his eyes. But Moreau didn't need to see his face. He knew who it was. "I was wondering when you'd finally see it," the man said, stepping forward. His voice was smooth, familiar, amused. The pieces clicked into place. Not just a forgotten object. Not just a missing box. The pattern. It had been in front of him the whole time. "Lemoyne didn't write your name as a warning," Moreau said slowly, his voice quiet but sure. "He wrote it because he knew." Villard's breath hitched behind him. "Moreau!" Moreau's grip on his revolver didn't waver. His eyes locked onto the figure in the doorway. "Villard," he said, his voice cold. "You were never a victim, were you?" Villard's face was a mask of quiet resignation, but Moreau saw it now, the tension in his shoulders, the calculation in his gaze. The fear he had displayed earlier wasn't the fear of a victim. It was the fear of a man who knew his time was running out. The man in the doorway took a slow step forward, shaking the damp from his coat. "You always were sharp, Moreau," he said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "But even you took longer than I expected." Moreau didn't lower his revolver. "You have me at a disadvantage," he said. "I don't believe we've been formally
introduced." The man smiled faintly. "No, but you've been following my work. The Undertaker, wasn't it?" He let out a short, dry laugh. Crude, but not inaccurate. Moreau's fingers tightened around the grip of his revolver.
"And Villard? What is he to you?" The pause that followed was telling. Villard's gaze flickered toward the man at the door, a silent exchange passing between them. Moreau saw the answer before either of them spoke. "He's your partner," Moreau said flatly. Villard exhaled, rubbing his bruised wrist. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" Moreau asked. "Lemoyne found out, didn't he? That's why you had to get rid of him." Villard's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think I wanted any of this?" His voice was quieter now, carrying a note of something close to regret. "I had no choice." "There's always a choice." Villard looked away. The Undertaker stepped closer, unbothered by the weapon still pointed at him. "Tell me, Moreau," he mused, "what do you think this is really about? Smuggling? A petty crime ring?" He tilted his head. "You still don't see it, do you?" Moreau studied him, every instinct screaming that he was missing something. He had assumed this was about money, maybe revenge. But the Undertaker's confidence, the way he regarded Moreau not as a nuisance, but as an equal, there was something else at play here. Moreau thought back to the beginning. The murders, the missing box, the list of names. The people who had died weren't just random casualties. They were deliberate choices. Lemoyne, the old informant. Berger, the
low-level fence. Even Dubois, the accountant, had been tied to...
Realization struck him cold. Moreau lowered his gun slightly. "This isn't about money at all," he said slowly. "It's about history." The undertaker's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Moreau pressed on. The ledger wasn't just a record of illegal dealings, it was a map, a trail leading back to something that was supposed to stay buried. He thought of the box Villard had hidden in the cellar, of the desperate way people had searched for it. That box, it wasn't just some forgotten trinket, was it? It was proof. Villard's jaw tightened, but it was the undertaker who answered. "Proof," he echoed. "That's an interesting word." Moreau could see it now, the connections forming with startling clarity. "Who were you before you were the undertaker?" he asked. "Before all of this?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth
in it. "A footnote," he said.
"An afterthought in someone else's story." Moreau took a step forward, his gun lowering a fraction more. "You were erased." The silence in the room stretched. Rain drummed softly against the window. The undertaker let out a quiet breath. "Do you know what it's like to have your entire existence wiped away?" he asked. "To be told you were never here, that your name is not worth remembering." He met Moreau's gaze. That ledger was more than transactions, it was a reckoning, a reminder that history isn't written by those who deserve it, it's written by those who win. Moreau's pulse steadied. He had seen men driven by greed, by anger, by vengeance. But this was something else entirely. This was a man trying to write himself back into history. The undertaker took another step forward, his voice calm. "I was never after money, Moreau. I was after truth." "And the bodies you left behind?" Moreau asked. "Were they truth as well?" The undertaker didn't flinch. "Some men don't deserve the legacy they steal." Moreau looked at Villard. "And you? Did you believe in all of this? Or were you just too afraid to say no?" Villard's throat worked. He stopped himself. He didn't have an
answer. Or maybe he had too many. Moreau turned back to the undertaker. "You think this ends with me?" he asked. "You think you'll walk away from this?" The man studied him, then smiled faintly. "I think history has already decided."
And then he moved. The gunshot rang out before Moreau even registered pulling the trigger. Villard shouted, diving aside as the undertaker staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his coat, dark against the fabric, but he remained. Standing, Moreau aimed again. "It's over." The undertaker's lips twitched, amusement flickering even through the pain. "Oh, Moreau," he murmured. "It's never over." Then, before Moreau could react, the man turned and vanished into the storm. Rain pounded against the cobblestones, drumming against the roofs and gutters of the narrow Saint-Michel alleyways. The storm had thickened, turning the streets into a maze of flickering gaslight and shifting shadows. Moreau ran, boots splashing through puddles, his revolver clenched tight in his hand. The undertaker was bleeding. He couldn't have gone far. But Moreau knew better than to think this would end easily. Villard stumbled behind him, clutching his side, his breath ragged. He won't run forever," he panted. "He'll double back." Moreau barely acknowledged him. He could feel it, that almost imperceptible shift in the air, before something snapped into place. The hunt was ending. The moment came at the mouth of a narrow passage near the Seine. Moreau spotted a faint smear of blood along the stone wall, leading toward the old printing shop, long abandoned. The city had tried to board it up years ago, but the place had always had a way of opening itself to those who needed it. Tonight, it had become a tomb. Moreau stepped inside. The air smelled of damp paper and ink, overlaid with the sharp tang of gunpowder. A single candle flickered on a table in the center of the room, its flame barely holding against the draught. And in the shadows, just beyond the weak glow, stood the undertaker. His coat was soaked, the left sleeve dark with blood. But he stood,
straight, composed, as if the pain were merely an inconvenience. His gun was gone, perhaps discarded in the alley, but he didn't need it. His presence alone carried a weight heavier than bullets. Moreau didn't raise his revolver. Not yet. You
knew I'd follow, he said. The undertaker gave a faint nod. Of course. Moreau stepped forward, slow and deliberate. You talk about history, he said. About truth. But this was never about that. This was about you. The undertaker let out a quiet chuckle. Isn't everything? His voice was calm, but there was something behind it now, something fraying at the edges. You killed for it, Moreau continued. For a name, for a place in the past. You think that ledger, that box, would make you real? That people would look back and see you for what you were? The undertaker's jaw tightened. They erased us, he said, voice low. They buried our stories, took what we built, and left us as ghosts. His eyes darkened. I merely returned the favor. Moreau tilted his head slightly. But that's not why you killed Lemoyne. A pause. The undertaker's fingers curled into a fist. No, Moreau took another step. He knew something, didn't he? Something about you, not about the ledger or the smuggling or even the bodies you buried. He knew you. The air in the room shifted. The undertaker exhaled. Lemoyne was smarter than I gave him credit for, he admitted. He put it together before anyone else. Knew who I was before I even stepped into that cafe. I should have let him be. But he trailed off, shaking his head slightly. He didn't understand. Moreau felt it now. The
final puzzle piece sliding into place. You were never erased, Moreau said softly. You were hiding. The undertaker met his gaze.
And for the first time, Moreau saw it. The exhaustion beneath the confidence, the weight of a story carried too long. You were one of them, Moreau murmured. One of the names in that ledger, but not as a victim. His breath steadied. As a traitor. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then the undertaker smiled. A traitor, he mused. Is that what you think? His eyes flickered toward Villard, who had pressed himself against the doorway, watching with wide, unreadable eyes. Tell me, Inspector, when you look at your friend there, do you see a traitor, or just a man who made choices? Villard flinched. Moreau ignored the distraction. You made your choices too. And I stand by them. Moreau nodded slowly. Then you know how this ends. The undertaker studied him. The blood loss was catching up now. His movements were just a fraction slower, his breath just a bit uneven. But his eyes remained sharp. I should have killed you when I had the chance, he said. Moreau sighed. People keep telling me that. Then, in the space of a breath, the undertaker moved. Moreau had expected it, had felt the shift a second before it happened. His hand was already tightening on the revolver when the undertaker lunged for the candle, knocking it onto the table and sending papers up in flames. The room exploded with sudden fire and smoke, the flickering shadows distorting the space in an instant. Moreau fired. The bullet struck the undertaker in the leg, sending him sprawling against the wall. But even as he fell, his hand shot out, knocking over the old wooden shelf beside him. Moreau ducked as it crashed down, splinters flying. By the time he turned back, the undertaker was gone. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. The flames crackled, licking hungrily at the edges of the old documents. Villard stood frozen, his face caught between terror and something else, something like relief. Moreau exhaled, gripping his revolver. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. Moreau stepped out into the night, the rain cooling his skin as he drew in a breath thick with smoke and gunpowder. The undertaker was out there, bleeding and desperate. He wouldn't make it far in his condition. But a cornered man was the most dangerous kind. Villard staggered beside him, his face pale and unreadable, though Moreau had caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes when the undertaker had spoken his name. That brief hesitation, the way guilt and something deeper had flashed across his expression. Moreau had spent his life reading people, and that moment had told him more than any confession ever could. They moved quickly, following the smear of blood along the alley's edge. The streets were nearly empty now, the late hour, and the storm having driven most indoors. Only the distant glow of lanterns and the occasional bark of a stray dog broke the silence. Moreau pressed forward, each step tightening the coil of tension in his gut. Then suddenly the blood trail stopped. No collapsed body, no sign of struggle, just the steady, glistening sheen of rain pooling against the stones. Moreau frowned, scanning the alley. "He's gone," Villard murmured. Moreau shook his head. "Not gone, hiding." His eyes flicked to the side, to the narrow door of a butcher's shop just barely ajar. The same shop whose owner had been arrested 3 days prior, leaving the place empty. He stepped forward, pushing the door open, with the barrel of his revolver. Inside, the darkness swallowed them. The air smelled of raw meat and iron, the scent of blood both fresh and old. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he moved deeper, his revolver steady. And then he saw him. The undertaker sat slumped against a wooden crate, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. His leg was stretched out before him, a dark stain spreading across his trousers. His face, normally so composed, was lined with pain, but his eyes still held that sharp, knowing glint. "Well?" he rasped. "I suppose this is where you finish it." Moreau didn't lower his gun. "That depends," he said. "Are you going to tell me who gave the order?" A slow smile curled on the undertaker's lips. "Oh, Moreau," he murmured. "Haven't you figured it out yet?" Something in his tone sent a chill down Moreau's spine. And then Villard spoke. "Enough," he said quietly. "It's over." Moreau turned, his grip on the revolver tightening. Villard's face was carefully neutral, but his hand was resting near the inside of his coat where his own revolver was holstered, and in that moment everything clicked into place. The hesitation, the familiarity in the undertaker's voice when speaking to Villard. The way Villard had always been one step behind, always arriving just late enough that the real killer could slip through his fingers. Moreau exhaled sharply. "It was you," he murmured. "From the very beginning." Villard's jaw tensed. "You don't understand." But Moreau did. The undertaker had been a weapon, a ruthless, efficient one, but weapons needed direction. Someone had been guiding his hand, someone with access to police reports, someone who knew when to act and when to hold back, someone Moreau had trusted. The final piece of the puzzle. Villard sighed. Lemoine found out, he admitted. Not just about the undertaker, about everything. He was going to expose us all. His eyes darkened. I had no choice, Rowe felt the weight of the moment settle in his bones. And now? He asked. Are you going to kill me too? A long silence. Then Villard's expression shifted. Regret flickered across his face, but it was fleeting. His hand moved toward his gun. Moreau fired first. The gunshot echoed through the butcher's shop, the smell of gunpowder mixing with the scent of blood. Villard stumbled back, his revolver slipping from his grasp as he clutched his shoulder, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The undertaker chuckled weakly. Didn't see that coming, he muttered. Moreau turned back to him. No more games. Who else is involved? The undertaker exhaled, leaning his head back against the wall. It doesn't matter, he said. You cut off the head, but the body will keep moving. Moreau studied him for a long moment. We'll see about that. The time the other officers arrived, the storm had begun to fade. The undertaker was barely conscious, his strength finally giving out. Villard, restrained and silent, refused to meet Moreau's gaze. It was over, or so it seemed. The rain had stopped by the time Moreau stepped out of the butcher's shop, the night air damp with the lingering scent of gunpowder and something colder. Betrayal. The gas lamps cast flickering shadows against the slick cobblestones as officers hurried past him, their boots splashing through puddles as they secured the crime scene. Villard sat slumped against the curb, his wounded shoulder wrapped hastily in a torn section of his own coat, his expression unreadable. Moreau had seen that look before, on men who knew they had lost but refused to admit it, a quiet resignation laced with defiance. You should have been smarter, Moreau murmured, lighting a cigarette with a steady hand. The smoke curled around them as he exhaled slowly, watching Villard with a detached curiosity. You almost had me, Villard scoffed. You always
think you're a step ahead, Moreau. His voice was hoarse, strained. But you don't see everything.
Moreau studied him for a moment before crouching to his level. Then tell me, he said, his voice even. What did I miss? Villard held his gaze, a slow smile curling at the edges of his lips. You think this is over, he whispered. You think Lemoyne was the only one who knew. Something in his tone sent an uneasy ripple through Moreau's chest. He had expected resistance, maybe even regret, but not this. Not amusement. Moreau straightened, inhaling deeply as he considered the weight of Villard's words. The pieces had fallen into place so perfectly, the undertaker, the web of corruption, the final betrayal, but there was something else, wasn't there? Something just out of reach. A sharp voice cut through his thoughts. Inspector. One of the officers approached, his face drawn with concern. We found something on Villard. He handed over a small envelope, its edges slightly damp from the rain. Moreau flicked open the seal, his eyes narrowing as he pulled out a folded note. The writing was precise, deliberate. He knew too much. If you're reading this, then you know what to do. No signature. No indication of its sender. But Moreau knew, with a sick certainty settling in his stomach, that Villard was right. This wasn't over. He turned back to his former colleague, whose smirk had grown slightly. You see it now, don't you? Villard murmured. You think I was the mastermind? I was just doing what I had to. The real power... He exhaled, shaking his head. You'll never touch them. Moreau studied him, his cigarette burning low between his fingers. The truth had come to light, but justice? That was another matter entirely. He had taken down the man pulling the trigger, but the hand guiding him? That shadow, still loomed. The sound of a carriage pulling up broke the moment. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, hauling Villard to his feet. He winced, but didn't resist. As they led him toward the awaiting transport, he glanced back once, his eyes glinting with something Moreau couldn't quite name. Pity? Amusement?
Warning! Moreau let the cigarette drop, crushing it beneath his heel. He knew how these things worked. The paperwork would be filed, the city would sigh in relief, and the case would be deemed solved.
But Moreau had been in this game too long to believe in simple resolutions. The real villains never dirtied their own hands. As the carriage disappeared into the mist, Moreau turned away, his mind already working through the next steps. Justice had been served, or so they would say. Moreau stood outside the butcher's shop, staring at the spot where the carriage had disappeared into the mist. The city around him exhaled, a collective sigh of relief, the kind that followed the closing of a case, the restoring of order. But Moreau didn't move. Not yet. The rain had washed the streets clean, but it had left something behind, a nagging feeling at the edges of his mind, like a faint outline on a slate that had never been fully erased. He reached into his coat and pulled out the note taken from Villard's pocket, the paper slightly damp from the night air. He knew too much. If you're reading this, then you know what to do. Moreau's thumb traced the edge of the page, his gaze darkening. Villard's smirk. The way he had spoken, not as a man caught, but as a man who still held a secret. His words hadn't been desperate, they had been confident. You think this is over? You think Lemoine was the only one who knew? Moreau had been a detective long enough to know the difference between bravado and certainty. Villard hadn't been boasting, he had been telling the truth. A gust of wind rustled the note in his fingers. He turned it over, examining it again. The handwriting, it was precise, deliberate. Not Villard's, not Lemoine's. It belonged to someone else, someone still out there. His fingers curled around the paper as he exhaled, glancing up at the gas lamp flickering above him. He had seen it before, the way cases like this ended. The papers would call it a triumph, the officials would close the files, but Moreau knew better. A conspiracy like this didn't die with one arrest. He turned, his steps slow, as he walked back toward the Saint-Michel Café, the place where all of this had begun. The streets had emptied, leaving only the distant sounds of carriages and the occasional shout from a late-night reveller. The cafes. Dharma was still unlocked, the scent of coffee and old wood lingering inside. Moreau moved to his usual table, the one in the corner where he could see the whole room. The same chair where he had sat days ago when the first piece of this case had fallen into his lap. He pulled out a match, striking it against the rough wood of the table, watching the flame flicker in the dim light. There was something missing.
A final piece. His gaze drifted to the window where his reflection stared back at him. And then, just for a moment, he thought he saw something. A figure, a shadow moving just beyond the glass. It was gone in an instant, swallowed by the darkness, but the feeling it left behind settled deep in Moreau's chest. Someone was still watching. A smile ghosted across his lips as he leaned back.
In his chair, exhaling a thin line of smoke. The city never really slept, and neither did its mysteries. Moreau had solved one case, but another was already waiting in the wings.